In the dimly lit halls of medieval castles and monasteries, an enigmatic love story unfolded, one that has puzzled and captivated scholars for centuries. The tale of David and Jonathan, celebrated in both Christian and Jewish texts, is a story of a bond so powerful that it defies the boundaries of conventional love. This was not just any friendship. It was an ennobling, courtly relationship that paralleled marriage in its intensity and commitment, yet it never replaced the traditional union of man and wife. In the Middle Ages, this relationship was seen as pure and selfless, a noble friendship that was both hierarchical and complex. Jonathan, the king's son and a seasoned warrior, took David, a young shepherd boy with a slingshot, under his wing. He bestowed upon David arms and armor, symbolizing a deep and protective bond. In the Latin Vulgate Bible, David's words on Jonathan's death are poignant. He describes himself as the lover and Jonathan as the beloved, comparing his love to that of a mother for her child. This de-eroticized statement highlights the medieval understanding of their relationship as a pure and virtuous one. However, the story of David and Jonathan is not the only example of male-male love in medieval times. A 1994 book by John Boswell, Same-Sex Unions in Premodern Europe, sparked intense debate among scholars. Boswell argued that certain medieval ceremonies, such as the Greek adelphopoia, a ceremony of brotherhood, were akin to modern gay marriage. Critics countered that these ceremonies were more about passionate or erotic friendship than marriage. In the Middle Ages, marriage was primarily a legal arrangement to legitimize children and facilitate the transfer of property. Same-sex unions, while deeply committed, did not serve these purposes. They represented a type of relationship that modern society struggles to recognize, a bond that was more than just friendship, but not quite marriage. The acceptance of these close and loving relationships was more widespread in medieval times than it is today, but they were not without controversy. Young men, chosen for their military prowess and good looks, were often fostered at court and given privileges. This system, while intended to nurture talent, also raised questions about the nature of these relationships. In the early 12th century romance Amies and Amelun, the two protagonists pledge their loyalty to each other and are appointed to high positions at King Charles's court. Amies becomes the king's treasurer, and Amelun his cupbearer. The role of cupbearer, in particular, would have reminded the educated public of the myth of Jupiter and Ganymede, where the god of the sky takes a beautiful young boy as his lover. This myth, well known in the Middle Ages, often appeared in art, such as the 12th century sculpture at the Abbey Church of St. Marie Magdalene in Vézelay, where Jupiter is depicted as forcefully taking Ganymede. The mid-12th century Archbishop of Tours, Hildebert of Lavardin, warned against the dangers of such relationships. A boy is not at all a safe thing. Do not devote yourself to any of them. Many a house is reported to have many Joves, but you should not hope for heaven through Ganymede's sin. No one comes to the stars through this type of military service. A male wife has the underworld. Despite these warnings, the allure of these relationships persisted, especially among the nobility and the courtly class. Medieval literature, particularly in the realm of courtly love, provides a rich tapestry of relationships that challenge our modern assumptions about heterosexuality. While knights were expected to love and serve ladies, their closest ties were often to their lords or fellow knights. In the stories of Crescent de Troyes, for example, the love of a lady was a means for a knight to prove his valor and win the admiration of other men. The knight's goal was not the lady herself, but the recognition of his manhood. Even in the most romantic tales, the knight's deepest bonds were often with other men. In the 12th century French romance Aeneas, the Queen of Latium describes Aeneas as a man who prefers boys to women, a preference that does not diminish his masculinity. She suggests that a young man might be bribed into a sexual relationship with an older man by the promise of access to the latter's young wife. This scenario, while fictional, reveals that the medieval understanding of male-male love did not necessarily equate to effeminacy or a lack of masculine virtue. The story of Amies and Amelun further illustrates the depth of male-male bonds in medieval literature. The two friends swear an oath to each other that takes precedence over their marriage vows. Whether their love was sexual is not the focus. The story is a love story in every sense, emphasizing the strength and commitment of their relationship. Despite the Church's criticisms of sodomy, the ideal of male love and friendship continued throughout the Middle Ages. As long as men fulfilled their marital duties, their relationships with other men were not necessarily seen as problematic. The medieval understanding of these relationships was nuanced, recognizing the complexity of human emotions and the various forms they could take. In the Muslim world of medieval Spain, a rich body of poetry celebrated love between men. Both Muslim and Jewish poets wrote passionately about their male friends, a practice that continued despite religious prohibitions against sodomy. This suggests that the cultural context of these relationships was as important as the religious one, and that love between men was a recognized and valued part of life. The medieval world, with its complex social and cultural norms, offers a fascinating glimpse into the many forms that love and friendship could take. The relationships between men, whether platonic, passionate, or sexual, challenge our modern binary understandings of love and sexuality. In the halls of medieval castles and the pages of ancient texts, these bonds tell a story of human connection that is both timeless and profoundly human. Navigating the complex landscape of medieval sexuality presents historians with a unique challenge. On one hand, there is a reluctance to apply a universal concept of human nature to the past, as this can obscure the profound differences between medieval cultures and our own. On the other hand, if historians entirely reject the idea that we can understand the inner lives of people from the past, they risk undermining the very basis of historical interpretation. This tension is particularly evident when examining expressions of desire in medieval texts. For example, when a medieval writer expresses profound longing for the presence and physical touch of another, we might reasonably consider this an erotic desire, even if the person in question would not have recognized it as such. This does not mean that all such desires were acted upon, or that medieval people necessarily wished to act on them. However, it does mean that the history of such desires is an essential part of the broader history of sexuality. In late Lombard Italy, for instance, historians like Ross Balzaretti have studied the complexities of sexual relationships and norms. Balzaretti's work reveals that medieval people had nuanced understandings of sexual desire and behavior, which were often shaped by social, economic, and religious context. Similarly, in medieval England, women's roles and experiences were deeply influenced by the economic and social structures of the time, as explored by J.P. Goldberg in her study of women in York and Yorkshire. The city of Florence in the Renaissance provides another rich case study. Guido Ruggiero and Richard Trexler have examined the intricate world of prostitution and sexual norms in 15th century Florence. Ruggiero's work, The Boundaries of Eros, delves into the legal and social regulations surrounding sex crimes and sexuality, while Trexler's research on prostitution highlights the patronage and client relationships that define this aspect of Florentine life. Apprentices in medieval Europe also had their own experiences with sexual desires and practices. Ruth Mazo Keres's book, From Boys to Men, explores how young men navigated the transition to adulthood, often involving visits to brothels and other forms of sexual activity. These experiences highlight the ways in which sexual norms were both regulated and transgressed in medieval society. In medieval literature, the expression of erotic desire is often veiled in metaphor and allegory. For example, in medieval French romances, the theme of the knight and the maiden frequently explores themes of love and desire. In the works of Chrétien de Troyes, such as Lancelot the Knight of the Cart, the knight's passionate desire for Guinevere is a central motif. These narratives not only reflect the cultural values of the time, but also provide insights into the emotional and psychological experiences of medieval people. Religious texts and penitentials offer another window into medieval attitudes towards sexuality. Pierre J. Payer's Sex and the Penitentials examines the development of sexual codes from the 6th to the 12th century, showing how the Church's views on sexuality evolved over time. The penitentials, which were guides for confessors, provide detailed descriptions of various sexual sins and their appropriate penances, reflecting the Church's efforts to regulate sexual behavior. In the Byzantine world, the works of canonists like Xenares provide insights into the religious and cultural understandings of sexuality. Marula Parasandi's study of Xenares' treatise on nocturnal emissions, for example, reveals the complex theological and moral considerations surrounding sexual dreams and desires. Similarly, in Western Europe, Diane Elliott's Fallen Bodies explores the medieval understanding of nocturnal emissions and their implications for male embodiment and moral purity. Historians must also be cautious when interpreting legal and court records, as these sources often reflect the biases and concerns of the time. For instance, court records from medieval London, such as those from the consistory court, provide glimpses into the legal proceedings surrounding sexual offenses. These records can be invaluable for understanding how sexual norms were enforced, but they must be read with an awareness of the social and legal contexts in which they were produced. Ultimately, the challenge for historians is to strike a balance between recognizing the universal human experience of desire and acknowledging the profound cultural differences that shaped medieval understandings of sexuality. By carefully analyzing a range of sources, literary, religious, legal, and social historians can gain a deeper and more nuanced understanding of the complex and diverse world of medieval sexuality. In the Middle Ages, people didn't have the same access to images and media that we do today. They couldn't see naked bodies or explicit sexual content everywhere they looked, as we often do in modern times. This difference in how sexuality was perceived and experienced is important to understand when we look at medieval culture. Medieval people didn't have the internet, television, or magazines, so they didn't spend much time thinking about or seeing sexual content. Instead, their lives were deeply influenced by the church and religious beliefs. The church taught that the body was a creation of God, and that it was important to control one's desires, especially sexual ones. This focus on controlling the body was part of a broader concern with spiritual life and the afterlife. One of the most influential historians, Caroline Bynum, argues that while we today might think about bodies primarily in terms of sex, medieval people had different concerns. For them, food and the body's fate after death were more important. Food was a central part of daily life, because it wasn't always easy to come by. People had to work hard to grow, harvest, and prepare food, and this made it a significant part of their lives. For many, especially for monks and nuns, controlling what and how much they ate was a way to show their commitment to a spiritual life. Death was also a constant presence in medieval life. People saw sick and dying individuals frequently, and the church often reminded them of the inevitability of death through sermons and artwork. This led to a deep concern about what would happen to their bodies after they died. Would they decay and be forgotten, or would they be resurrected and made whole again? These questions about the body's fate after death were just as important as questions about the soul's journey. Despite these concerns, sex and sexual behavior were still significant in medieval society. The church was very strict about when and how sexual activity was allowed. For example, sex was only considered acceptable within marriage, and for the purpose of having children. Any other form of sexual activity was seen as a sin. This focus on controlling sexual behavior was part of a broader effort to control the body and its desires, which were seen as potential sources of sin. The church's teachings on sex and the body were reflected in many aspects of medieval life, including literature and art. For instance, stories and sermons often warned about the dangers of sexual temptation and the importance of remaining chaste. This was especially true for religious figures like monks and nuns, who were expected to live lives of celibacy. At the same time, medieval people recognized that the body was a part of God's creation and had value. The belief in the incarnation of Christ, where God became human, emphasized that the body was not inherently evil. However, controlling the body's desires, especially sexual ones, was seen as a way to achieve spiritual purity and closeness to God. While food and death were significant concerns, the church's teachings on sex and the body had a lasting impact on medieval society. These teachings influenced how people thought about their bodies, their relationships, and their place in the world. Even though medieval people didn't have the same exposure to sexual content as we do today, their attitudes towards sex and the body were deeply ingrained in their culture and continue to influence our modern understanding of sexuality. In medieval times, women's roles were closely tied to their ability to nurture and feed their families. This nurturing role was deeply connected to their roles as mothers, and before effective contraception, this meant that their fertility and sexuality were closely linked. The female breast in medieval art, often depicted in religious contexts like the Madonna and Child, symbolized nurturing more than it did modern sexual connotations. However, the act of nurturing children was inseparable from the act of bearing them, which in turn was inseparable from the process of conception, a process that, for all but the Virgin Mary, involved sexual intercourse. Engels, a famous thinker, described the work typically done by women in the home like cooking and cleaning as reproductive labor. This referred to the work that sustains the labor force, keeping them fed, clothed, and housed. While this kind of labor is different from the productive labor done by men in fields like agriculture or industry, it still relied on the physical reproduction of children. Without the need to feed and care for the next generation, there would be no need for the labor that sustains the household. The relationship between sex and death is complex and often represented in medieval art. Late medieval art frequently reminded people to think about death, encouraging them to live good lives and be prepared for the end. Symbols of life, such as youth, beauty, and fertility, were often contrasted with symbols of death. Birth and growth were seen as the opposite of death, and sex was an essential part of this cycle of life. For example, the crucifixion, a common subject in Christian art, focused on Christ's death, but it also emphasized his humanity, which would have led people to think about the nature of divine versus human conception. The Madonna and Child, another common theme, highlighted the purity of the Virgin Mary, which, by contrast, implied the impurity of other human conceptions. Medieval people had a different relationship with sex compared to modern times. While sex is more openly discussed and depicted in modern media, medieval people were more likely to witness actual sexual acts, especially in rural settings where privacy was limited. Weddings often included the couple being placed in bed together in front of witnesses, and children would have had more sexual knowledge by the time they reached puberty than many modern children do. The concept of childhood innocence, as we understand it today, was different in the Middle Ages. Medieval children could marry at a young age, and sexual activity was seen as a natural part of growing up and preparing for adulthood. The denial of sexual activity was a significant part of the identity of priests and members of religious orders. This denial did not make sexuality unimportant. Rather, it kept it at the forefront of people's minds. Sexual abstinence was a way to demonstrate spiritual purity, but it also meant that discussions about sex and its regulation were constant. Sexuality was also used to express the relationship between humans and the divine in all three major religions of the Middle Ages: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Sermons and religious texts often use the language of desire and pleasure to describe the relationship between humans and God. This language would have been familiar to medieval people, making sexuality a central part of their understanding of faith. Understanding medieval attitudes towards sexuality is crucial for understanding medieval culture. The Middle Ages saw the development of many laws and norms that still influence modern sexual behavior. Despite a shared cultural tradition, the ways medieval people constructed sexual identities are quite different from those of the modern world. This difference teaches us that our current norms are not natural, but are shaped by historical contexts. Some scholars argue that the Middle Ages were so different from the modern era that they are not relevant for comparison. However, this otherness is precisely what makes the Middle Ages valuable for study. The Middle Ages provide a unique perspective on how societies construct and regulate sexual behavior, and these insights can help us understand and reconceptualize marginalized bodies in the present. The idea that sex is bad because the body must be denied or is impure has roots in ancient Mediterranean thought, but it was during the Middle Ages that this idea shaped a whole body of law. The Middle Ages defined the limits of permissible sexual activity, including the notion that marriage is monogamous and indissoluble. The debate over whether sex is a gift from God, intended to enhance human existence, or a necessary evil for procreation, was also shaped during this period. The Reformation brought changes to the role of the church and state in regulating marriage, but the roots of these changes were laid in the Middle Ages. Urban governments in medieval times already regulated the sexual behavior of town residents, including sex work, adultery, and premarital sex. The modern era brought more effective means of regulation, but the goals of regulation were not entirely new. The Middle Ages were a time when religious and legal norms about sexuality were established, and these norms continue to influence modern attitudes and laws. Even in a secular world, the religious roots of our attitudes towards sexuality remain deeply embedded in our culture. The European Middle Ages, a time of chivalry, religious fervor, and feudal systems, is often seen as a period vastly different from our own. Yet, when we delve into its history, particularly in the realm of sexuality, we find a complex and diverse set of attitudes that mirror our own in many ways. The Middle Ages were not a monolithic era with uniform beliefs. Instead, they were dynamic, with ideas about sex, gender, and relationships that evolved over time and varied across regions. One of the most significant shifts in the history of sexuality occurred during the early modern period, when individualism began to rise. This led to a greater focus on the nuclear family and the household as a private sphere, as opposed to the larger kin group and the public sphere. This shift influenced modern ideas about sex, making it more individual and private. However, it's important to note that the regulation of sex by the community did not simply disappear. Governments continued to intervene in matters of sexuality, often constructing and regulating it through laws and norms. The medieval period also saw a rich tradition of romantic love, which permeated the culture through literature and art. This was not just a fantasy. It reflected real feelings and desires, even if not all marriages were based on love. Similarly, not all medieval marriages were arranged by families without considering the individual's preferences. The idea that marriages were solely about economic and social alliances is an oversimplification. In terms of scientific understanding, the Middle Ages had its own theories about the body and reproduction. Thomas Lacure's work suggests that the Aristotelian one-seed theory, which dominated from ancient times until the 18th century, was not universally accepted. Many medieval thinkers believed that both men and women contributed to reproduction, even if they did not understand the exact mechanisms. This shows that medieval ideas about the body were not static, and were influenced by the cultural and social context. The history of homosexuality in the Middle Ages is another area where modern and medieval views intersect and diverge. While some scholars argue that the concept of homosexuality as a sexual identity is a modern invention, others highlight the existence of same-sex relationships and their recognition in medieval society. This debate underscores the complexity of medieval attitudes and the ways in which they can challenge our modern assumptions. Gender roles in the Middle Ages were also more fluid than we might think. The idea that femininity was inherently passive, for example, was not universally held. Women could be powerful figures, and sexual relationships were not always seen as one person acting upon another. This shift in understanding gender and sexuality is closely tied to broader changes in society, such as the rise of individualism and the changing roles of women. The Middle Ages, therefore, offer a rich tapestry of ideas and practices that are both familiar and foreign. They remind us that our modern views on sexuality are not timeless or natural, but are constructed and can change. By studying the Middle Ages, we can see how our own ideas about sex, gender, and relationships are shaped by history and culture. This historical perspective can help us understand the complexities and variations in human behavior and desire, and it can challenge us to think more critically about our own beliefs and assumptions. In the end, the Middle Ages are neither a golden age of perfect adherence to religious norms, nor a counter-golden age of free and open sexual expression. Instead, they were a period of diverse and evolving attitudes, much like our own. By exploring this complexity, we can gain a deeper understanding of the human experience and the ways in which we construct and live our lives.